Okay, good morning. This meeting of the Conflicts of Interest Board is being conducted pursuant to New York State Open Meetings Law, Public Officers Law, Sections 100 et sec. For purposes of this meeting, I am designating Julia Lee as our recording secretary. Today we have before us consideration of possible proposed amendments to Title 53 of the Rules of the City of New York. I'm going to begin. Are there any comments from the board and from the staff on the draft the staff prepared on proposed amendments to Title 53 of the rules? I might begin with some questions. Okay? Let me start with the definitions. One thing that puzzled me is, do we need to define agent? Agent comes up a lot in terms of the agent of an elected official. And I don't believe agent is anywhere defined. Do we need to say anything about that?
So, agent is not defined in the local law. I mean, that's certainly something we could do, although I don't know what we would say other than what a dictionary legal definition is, and so it could be.
Do we know if it's used at all in the campaign finance law or any more similar laws?
I'm not sure. I can.
I had sort of three questions on possible definitions.
Okay.
That was one. Second, maybe doesn't require a definition because the substance it's addressed in the substance. It's merely the word control. Again, a lot of this is about who's an agent of an elected official, and does that person or does the elected official control the entity?
Yeah. Maybe
Maybe that's worked out in substance or the multi-part criteria for deciding what the various covered agencies, but I did wonder whether or not we wanted to have a definition of control.
Sure. I mean, our thinking really is that the definition of control is contained in those those factors.
I think it was
I get
beyond the
that.
factors.
That's probably right. I just want, but I thought about the two most important concepts in this is, once we get past the elected official, is agency and control.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that control is picked up by the various substantive criteria, but I just wanted to put it out there. And one other thought, this actually, I was inspired by Carolyn's public testimony on this. To the question, when you were critical of the statute's use of the term loan, and you mentioned that it could pick up standard loans, I wonder if we want to define loans that it doesn't pick up, standard loans that issued in the ordinary course, just to address the objection you raised in the ordinary course by, with ordinary terms or something like that. Because I think that is normally exempted from restrictions. We talk about loans that are just issued by a standard financial entity under standard terms or something like that. I thought it was a legitimate point in your testimony, and I thought maybe we could reflect it by maybe a negative definition of loan.
Yes.
I don't think it'd be inconsistent with the statute.
I agree with you there, and we absolutely considered whether entities have whether this would be a problem, and our understanding of these not-for-profit entities is that they don't, in the normal course of things, take out loans, and so that it would essentially be a solution to something that's not a problem, and so certainly if it's determined in later on that it's a problem, I think we can absolutely add that. But at this point, we don't think that it's a problem in understanding the practices of these not-for-profit entities.
Anybody else? Anybody thoughts? I guess that still leaves me with my question of whether or not the board thinks we ought to ask for a definition of agent. Or do you think it's self-evident?
I don't think it's self-evident, but I think the factors will help bear that out. And I think we might be too restrictive if you define it.
And we're sure that there's no definition.
Well, I will make one point. There is, it does say, so on page 3 of Exhibit 1, which is Local Law 181, the agent of such a person shall include an appointee of such a person serving at the pleasure of such person. And so it's defined in a, in a small way to what it includes, and so that would include an agency head, for instance. And so it's very clear in the meaning of local law 181 that an agency head would be covered within this agent, the meaning of agent.
Yeah, I think the problem comes up more in the situation where the person running the entity is not a public official.
Yes.
I think you're right, it would, when it's an agent in a fund which is an adjunct to a city, like some of the classic funds,
Yes.
that's not a problem. The issue would come up more when the quote-unquote agent is what also someone might be considered to be an independently paid local consultant.
And that's certainly, as Erica mentioned, something that the board can consider when looking at an individual entity and whether it is a covered organization.
Well, could we, looking at it now, page 3, exhibit 1, said, so it's like.
Yes, it is sub 3, they're not, each definition is not numbered, and so there are multiple sub 1s, 2s, and 3s.
Right.
But the very first sub 3 on page 3.
But I'm going to go to the next paragraph where so in determining exercises control, and we list the factors. Would we interpret that these factors will apply to agency? Is that what you were thinking as well? So when we're evaluating whether the individual exercises control, would we necessarily be using these factors to evaluate agency as well?
I think you would evaluate whether that person is in fact an agent of the elected official. And so I think certainly that is contemplated within determining whether an entity is affiliated with an elected official. Certainly if the board determines that there's no agent of an elected official that is involved in the entity, then there's no basis for the entity's affiliation with an elected official. And so I think that's wrapped up in the entire totality of the circumstances in any given case.
Number 4, the degree of involvement or direction by the elected official. So let's say you give a definition of agent, and technically that's not an agent.
Well, I would point, so on that point, I would point to Exhibit 4, which are the proposed rules. So Exhibit 1 is Local Law 181, which is the law that the city council enacted, and Exhibit 4 would be the proposed rules themselves, and proposed board rules 3-03 would. One of our proposals was to include the agent in what was sub 4 in those factors. And so if you look, this is on page 5 of Exhibit 4, sub D. So we proposed, rather than including just the elected official, we propose that the board would consider as a factor the degree of involvement or direction by such an elected official or the elected official's agent in the organization's policies, operations, and activities. And so we propose expanding that category to capture, really what this relationship between an elected official and an agent is.
That makes sense. I like keeping it broad.
I think that does go more towards control to figure out who an agent is, but. Any other thoughts on the definitions?
Well, just connected to this, the language, one of the determinations as to whether it's under control is whether the board members appointed by such an elected official or agent serve for terms. What is
So
that's
that's
a significant serving term.
So my understanding of that, and that comes from the local law. So we reprinted the in the proposed board rule, in order to provide a comprehensive list, we reprinted the factors that are already existing in local law 181, just so that there's a single list for the board and for entities to look at, rather than having to look in two places. But my understanding of that is, essentially whether the elected official can fire the elected official or the agent can fire the board member, which would indicate a greater degree of control than if they serve for a set term without, a set term with more of a sense of independence. So I think that's the thinking behind it. Again, that wasn't our language, but my understanding is that if an elected official, or at least in thinking about that, if an elected official can, or the agent can fire a board member or a board member, then there would be more control over that entity. And so on balance, it would weigh towards determining that it's an affiliated entity.
I thought this was just a rewording of the factor whether the agent serves at the pleasure of the official. Is that someplace else still that serves at the pleasure of language,
So
or is this the same?
That would be, that would be in determining the definition of an agent, rather than, this is looking at the board member, which isn't necessarily an agent. The board member's loyalty is to the organization.
I want to come back to that 303 in a minute. I thought it may be actually useful, I should have said this at the beginning, I'm sorry, to actually walk through them rule by rule. So I sort of started out with 301, which are the definitions. And if anybody else had any further comments on the definitions, which are on Exhibit 4 on pages 1 through 1 through 3. Okay, and then I think since it's shorter, I don't have any thoughts, any comments on 302. The procedures for obtaining a determination by the board that an elected official or an agent of an elected official does not exercise control over anything. Okay. Then I want to go back to where we just were 1 minute ago, just in sort of in the name of some kind of deliberation. I guess this places it's sort of a general question about our rules. Just to what extent are we locked into literally restating the statute, which of course exists and we can't change, or whether it would be useful for us to, as we do in some other places, revise the text here so it's not doesn't literally parrot the statute, but makes it clearer to people who have to follow the statute. And that was one of the places I was stuck on, was exactly that. 303 sub 3. There seemed to be a lot of apples and oranges in that section, and I really wasn't quite clear how, when the disjunctive word that the two things on the opposite side of an or were not opposites. You could be both served for a term and be appointed upon nomination of other individuals. And it wasn't clear which way they cut. So I'm wondering whether it might be useful to rewrite that, say whether the board members are appointed by such an elected official or upon nomination of other officials, and maybe separately whether they serve for terms or at the pleasure of the elected official. It would make it clearer what the consequence of each is, because right now I was totally baffled by this. Serving for terms, so yeah, the same question, is it good or bad? And then I forgot there were actually two ors. There were two ors in that by such an elected official. I'm sorry, there's one or. There are three ors, but it's the second or is the key one.
Mm-hmm.
But you could be appointed by an elected official for a term, and you could serve for a term rather, and be appointed on nomination of someone else. So it just strikes me that there was an either or, which it's really, C is really two different disjunctions. One is appointed by an elected official on, without constraint, essentially, versus upon nomination of somebody else, or by somebody else. And the other is serving for terms versus serving at pleasure, right? And in each case, when you serve on the nomination of elected official, points more towards elected official control. And serving for terms, you were suggesting, I think you're right, suggests less elected official control. So it might even be worth making them parallel. So I kind of looked at, I know it's a literal quote from the statute, but in other places we don't treat ourselves as locked in by the statute. And of course, we can't, the statute exists, so it's not like we can change the statute.
Yes, and I think.
But I think rephrasing it is not inconsistent with the statute, it clarifies the statute.
Agreed, that would be a consistent rephrasing, and would clarify the meaning of the statute rather in any event, so that's certainly something that we could.
So maybe we can
could do.
rewrite
303C.
303C. I also had one other thought on this one,
Okay.
which is F, which again is, strike me as kind of cryptic. I don't know that we want to say more here, but what does it mean, the purpose of the organization?
Well, whether the organization is for a city purpose or whether the organization is for other entities. One of the examples, I think it was in Carolyn's testimony, was an alumni association of an elected officials university. And so really the purpose of that organization would be appropriate to determining whether it would be covered under 303. And so I think that, and that's consistent with how the board has considered entities, not-for-profit entities, whether in the past, in previous contexts, and it certainly would be relevant to this context as well.
We want to add that.
Yeah, I was wondering whether the purpose of, I'm actually, I like the subs that begin with whether.
Okay.
Because they give a sense of, that they cut in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And whether the purpose of the organization is a city purpose, or, I mean, that itself is open to interpretation, but at least it gives a stronger sense of where this is going. I don't think you have to change the D and E once I get that, you don't need to have a weather there. Well, actually, maybe weather
You're
versus
gonna
a
add
degree
city
isn't a
purpose,
terrible
yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
But I do think that whether the organization serves a city purpose is probably, gets at it better. Unless I'm missing something.
It
You're
signals
saying,
what we're
you're saying
thinking.
it's too broad, like we don't need to consider.
Well, it gets at, as Chris suggested, you may be, an official may be a prime mover behind an organization which is largely serves a private purpose, like promoting the person's college or something.
I think the whether it serves a city purpose might be too narrow,
Okay.
because,
Okay.
again, one of the concerns of the statute was serving the separate interests of the elected official. So
Okay.
it's not that,
So maybe flip it around and make it a negative purpose.
Are you saying it
Or
would be
the-
both, the city purpose and the individual?
right, because
Oh, I
one
see
of
what
the
you're saying.
issues was
It's
that
not
this
the
came out
spot.
of the campaign for New York,
Right.
so.
The political agenda.
Right,
So that leaves it
exactly, right, so a
debatable.
city purpose
Right.
wouldn't be the only operative factor, it's
Right.
just like completely irrelevant to the city, yes,
Yeah.
that's what I think,
It's
that's what.
it's
you
debatable
mean.
whether that is a city purpose, I guess, but what wouldn't be debatable
But
is.
that's not
is
the only question.
Right, right.
So maybe it serves a city purpose for
I guess my question is, what's wrong with considering the purpose of the organization? Like, I'm not sure I understand your question, the first question.
It just seemed to be, I wasn't sure what guidance it was giving. So all the others actually sort of tend to, except for the one that C, which was going to be revised, tend to cut one way or another. They tend to give some direction to
Doesn't
the
say-
board
yeah.
to get on the
The
road, or
board
to,
shall
or to,
consider
or to,
this.
or to the public as to which way it goes.
Doesn't
Whereas
signal-
this is like, okay, the purpose is to promote my kid's high school. Terrific, let's go on. I mean, it doesn't tell you that that's bad, or that cuts one way, that is not the wrong way. That could be a great thing. But that it cuts one way or the other. All the others seem to give some direction, that's all.
The only, I mean, this is being a little bit cynical, but
Yeah.
if you give the direction, in a cynical view, if you give too much direction, then that just allows me to set what I say my purpose is, because I'm trying to get around it, versus you're gonna consider generally, what am I doing and what is the purpose of the organization, and how much it benefits the city, how much it benefits me personally and my political agenda.
Well, it's not the stated purpose of the organization. I mean, I think the board or somebody will investigate what the true purpose of it is. But still, if it turns out the true purpose is to advance, a private matter versus a true purpose to advance something else, then I think some of some values. You're right, figuring out what the actual purpose is may sometimes be difficult, but once we have figured it out.
There's
we're
something that
really-
relates to the individual official that we could put? No, it's not the city purpose, but to benefit the.
Like whether the organization has a nexus to the official duties or to the interests of the elected official, something like that? Is that what you're getting at?
In other words, if it's not something that would be more dispositive
Right.
than city purpose, and something
Right.
that provides more clarity than what's the purpose?
Right.
Could you go the other way with the nexus, but the personal interest concept?
What are the purposes that give us pause?
Right.
What are the purposes of the city for this purpose?
Well, we didn't think purposes of the city was the only thing that was covered. We
What
don't think that.
What do we think a purpose of the city is when we talk about that? We're talking about a corporation that assists a particular agency in carrying out its duties, or more broadly, that this does some good for the citizens of the city in some way. What is the city purpose here? It brings me also to the argument, what is the universe of entities being covered? I understand the campaign for One New York stimulated this legislation, but who's covered? How many entities are out there? What are we actually, what was the city council looking at, and what are we looking at here? Are we looking at the entities that have been established over time to time by city agencies to assist them and raise funds to carry out their duties? Or are we talking about entities established by elected officials? And that's what we're talking about, we're not city agencies, but elected officials. To do what? To promote them? So I'm not sure what we're actually getting. I'm not sure what the statute is, quite frankly, aiming at. Whether there are other entities like the fund for One New York. This was a response by the city council. What is it that we're trying to regulate? And I'm not sure I really have a handle on what we mean by that. And using the term city purpose just triggers that in my mind. What are these agencies? They've got to be established by or on behalf of an elected official. So they're not necessarily the agencies we think of that assist other city agencies. So what is?
They are that,
Well,
because
if
of
they
the
are,
agent. It's the scope, the elected official or agent is intended to encompass every city affiliated not-for-profit. The Fund for Public Schools, the Fund for Public Health, the Mayor's Fund, all of those entities are encompassed by this law. It also encompasses entities that are founded by an elected official before that individual becomes an elected official, that serve the interests of that elected official if the elected official controls that institution, that not-for-profit.
So if an agency of the city sets up an entity to assist in the fact that the head of the city agency is an agent of the mayor, because the city agency, the term agent is used in that context.
Correct.
Yes, and that was part of the clarification when the city council defined an agent to include somebody who serves at the pleasure of an elected official.
Purpose was not in the statute, right?
Purpose was not in the statute, correct. It was, again, though, part of the board's totality examination in looking at organizations in similar contexts, in the government-to-government exception, in other contexts, in previous advisory opinions.
You know, that's the question that you asked, Jeff, is sort of one of the critical questions for the board, that city purpose issue. Because when there's determinations about waivers or post-employment issues, the issue that the board is looking at is, does this serve or conflict with the purposes and interests of the city? And those are factual determinations, and some of them are very clear, and some of them are very difficult. But that's part of the, sort of rubric that the board has always thought about in terms of city-affiliated not-for-profits and fundraising by high-level city officials for non-affiliated not-for-profits, what that, quote, city purpose is.
Although here it cuts, you're absolutely right, here it cuts in the opposite direction than normal. In other situations, it was important to get there to be a city purpose in order for it to be permissible, or to have city funds be used to it, or for the city to be involved. Here, I imagine if I'm a regulated, a person possibly subject to this law, I would want to establish that it's a non-city purpose, so that I don't have to comply with all these disclosures and the limits. I would want to show that when the mayor, or I already said mayor, when the mayor serves as chair of the Alumni Association of New York Law School, which couldn't be because he's not an alum, I think, but when the mayor serves as the chair of the Alumni Association of New York Law School, they wouldn't be subject to this, because the purpose, even though he's an elected official and he sits on the board, it's not serving a city purpose when it does it. So in some ways, the purpose is relevant, but you would sort of want to have, if you were the organization, you would be wanting to show you have a non-city purpose, and that way you wouldn't be subject to the disclosure requirements and whatever other rules.
Unless the
Am I reading
Alumni
that right?
Association were to print pictures of the mayor.
Well, if they start devoting 10% of their expenditures to promoting, then maybe they get picked up.
Right, to Carolyn's point, it's really whether it serves a city purpose or whether it serves the individual interests of the elected official, as
Or
to Jeff's point.
The official interests of the elected official.
Yes.
As opposed to their interests as an alum or a friend of the hospital.
Right, their duties to the organization
Yeah.
rather than.
There are also nonprofits that serve the interests of the agency itself, regardless of,
Right.
the individual who sits as the agency head. And I do think that this is what the intent of the statute was as well. So, I'm less concerned about the purpose and of the nonprofits. I think it'll be clearer,
Mhm.
and it'll be somewhat obvious as to which entities are created to advance the purposes and interests of the city, but also of the individual elected official's office, which arguably is to carry out those purposes and interests.
I guess one other question, again, when these rules get formally promulgated. What goes out, is there a commentary or a gloss, or is it just the rules? I know, for example, when in Federal Register, the agencies will publish their explanations, justifications. Will that be part of the official legal history of this, or is it just rules? You're not.
Yeah.
This commentary that you're seeing, so if you have edits to the commentary,
Okay.
that should be also,
Yeah.
that is public, that will be public.
So maybe a version of this conversation could come with the comments. In other words, explain when we're talking, so maybe the purpose, maybe the text of the reg is left alone, and maybe the comments spend a little more
Giving some
time
examples of
in talking about
purposes.
what we're, that some purposes wouldn't be covered, like your alumni association, and but city purpose, which would include agency purpose, and could include, I think this is right, political action to advance the office-related goals of the elected official. I think as in the campaign for 1 year. So maybe instead of trying to put it in the text.
Individual policymakers' priorities,
Right,
preferences.
but they're office-related priorities,
Yeah.
as opposed to their,
Right,
my
the
priority is
policymaker, the
is helping
policymaker
my
of that
synagogue
office,
and my
that's right,
church,
that's
yeah.
right.
Okay, so maybe we can put it in the commentary. That may be easy, it may be easier to work it through there.
Absolutely.
Anything else on 303? 304, this addresses the reporting, annual reporting by organizations affiliated with an elected official. Had a couple, a little noodly ones and one slightly bigger.
Okay.
So again, a lot of this because I think is where we're literally picking, the bigger problem, the problem's the one we're picking up in the statute. So in A sub 2, sub little 2,
Okay.
which is on page 7 of Exhibit 4, whether the donor had business dealings with the city on the date of such donation. What are the business dealings with the day before?
Well, business dealings with the city is defined in the statute to be listed in the doing business database. And so that encompasses transactions that occurred in some instances well before the
Which gets to my next question, which is that the regs go back and forth between saying business dealings and being in the doing business database. The fact that you're using both of them suggests that although they're supposed to be the same, it implies they might be different. In other words, if you look at little 1 is the name of any donor with business dealings with the city, and little 3 is whether the donor was ace. I wonder whether we could be consistent and just say have all of 1, 2, and 3 say in the doing business database, because that I think removes the issue.
Sure, I would only add that the person doing business with the city is also defined as that person, whether the individual who's making the donation or the individual's spouse, domestic partner, or unemancipated child are in the doing business database. And so it encompasses not just the individual who's making the donation, but close relatives. And so to do that, I think we would also, should say, the individual's spouse or domestic partner. We would lay out the family members, I think, in order to be consistent there with doing business with the city.
Okay, but it was just more, I said, but that kind of leads to a bigger question.
Okay.
But this one was just about just the fact that we seem to sort of toggle back and forth between having business dealings and then being in the doing business database. If they literally mean the same thing, we should use the same phrase, because otherwise this raises the possibility they mean different things.
I think it might be clear, it's an excellent point,
Yeah.
it might be clearer to go back to just business dealings with the city, so as an.
As defined by or something.
Right, yeah, I think
I'm a
that,
little agnostic, but.
yeah, no, it's a good point, yes.
And maybe even not on the date, but as of the date, because on the
Right.
date, literally, I've seen enough exam questions where it's the day before, it's the day after, what do you do? But the spouse, domestic partner, and unemancipated child, I was wondering, and I really couldn't figure it out, when we start talking about aggregating, do they get aggregated or not? In other words, trying to figure out that $400 thing. So let's say I'm a doing business person, and I give 200, and my spouse gives 200. Are we aggregated or are we not aggregated?
I think the intent is that be aggregated.
Because I couldn't tell. I mean, maybe it's there, but we aggregate if I gave 200 and then I give another 200, that's clearly aggregated.
Yes.
But it wasn't, maybe it's there, but I couldn't figure it out, whether if I give 200 and I have one I can't tell if the other one's emancipated or not.
No, we
But I have
should
at least
add-
one unemancipated child, and he gives $200, which of course he
Yeah,
got
no,
from
it's-
me, whether that's aggregated.
We should add,
He's not using all his lawn mowing money.
Yeah, he's making some money, but not enough.
Yeah,
No,
we'll add that.
that's
Yeah,
something
and
we
that
should
was
add.
my only, my truly significant point, which is I
Yes.
couldn't figure it out. And I assumed the intent was to aggregate from the households.
Right.
And I didn't,
Yeah.
I couldn't tell if it was there.
Yes, we'll clarify that to ensure it.
Would that be in the commentary as well, or?
I think that should be the text. Anybody else have any questions, comments, suggestions on 304? 304A, which is what we just did, which is the restricted organizations, and then turning to 304B, which is the unrestricted organizations. Could also refer to as the disclosure-only organizations. I was trying to figure out whether that will, unrestricted will trigger any bad bells, but I couldn't figure out anything else either. Restricted clearly is right for the restricted. The unrestricted are not unregulated, but I couldn't come up with I couldn't think of a better phrase, so I think it's fine, unless anybody else has any suggestions. But I didn't want to call them, but they're disclosure-only organizations, but that's not a great phrase either.
Yes, no, we struggled with that as well.
I can imagine. Any comments, questions, thoughts? Okay. And 305, record retention. Okay, so if I have us right, before I get to any formal motions, well, it's a good time to stop. Okay, so before proceeding to formal motions, I think I just want to recap where we are. I think we have approved the vast majority of what we've been presented with, but we have following suggestions for either changes or to think about or to add to the commentary. And as best I'm just trying to pull together my own notes, would be in the definition section to add a definition of loan that would leave out most commercial loans. Oh, no, wait, we took that out, I'm sorry. I think concluded that it was actually unnecessary, my mistake. I would ask the staff to consider whether there is a definition of agent that would be easy to locate and that would be useful to pop in. If you don't see anything, I think we can live without it. We can probably use common sense, but I think it would be a plus if there was a usable definition of agent, as long as we're going to make some revisions. There's going to be a revision of 303 sub C, so kind of break apart and rearrange the various clauses in that section. And there's going to be some commentary on, I think whatever the final subpart of that, the one about purpose. There's going to be some addition to the commentary to explicate the kinds of purposes that will likely be covered and the kinds of purposes that are not likely to be covered. In 304, there's going to be some consistency in the language of doing business with versus being in the doing business database. And that covers, I think, the first three little subs in A. And then there's going to be some new language addressing the question of the aggregation of contributions by spouses, domestic partners, and or the unemancipated children of the people who are doing business database. Is there anything else that anyone thinks requires attention when in the making of revisions? Okay, then I think given the formal options that are available to me, I'm going to call for a motion that the board continue this discussion at a future board meeting. The assumption that that discussion will focus primarily on the revisions and new material, but could include anything that the board deems relevant with respect to these rules. So, do I have a motion?
So moved.
Okay. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Signify by saying aye and raise your hand or whatever counts.
Aye.
Any opposed? No opposed. And so the motion for continuation of discussion has passed. There being no further discussion, no further business for consideration pursuant to the Open Meetings Law, this meeting is hereby adjourned.